Hey, welcome to my podcast where I discuss the origins of all sorts of things. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything, American Thanksgiving Edition. Today I'm talking about how the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth and friendly natives taught them how to farm, and at the end of the harvest they all sat down together to have a big feast to give thanks for their bounty, and everyone high-fived and lived happily ever after. Right? Sort of. That's the Thanksgiving story we were taught in grade school. What parts of that story are true, and how much of it is folklore? Today's episode aims to answer that question. So grab a turkey leg and some pumpkin pie, and get comfortable, because we're about to dig into the true story of the origin of Thanksgiving. The first Thanksgiving took place in 1621 in Plymouth, Massachusetts, indeed, but a lot had already happened between the natives and Europeans before that. These pilgrims were not the first to arrive on American soil. Remember that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. His voyages landed Europeans in different parts of the Caribbean, but in short order, more Europeans would make the journey across the Atlantic, landing first in Newfoundland, then in Florida, and eventually the English would settle the Roanoke colony in North Carolina in 1585. When a relief ship arrived a few years later, everyone had mysteriously vanished. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a tree. This came to be known as the Lost Colony. To this day, no one really knows what became of the 100-plus colonists. The first permanent English settlement was, of course, the Jamestown Colony in Virginia, established in 1607. This was the one with John Smith and Pocahontas. The romantic relationship between them is entirely fiction, by the way. Pocahontas, at a very young age, was an important figure, serving as a mediator and a liaison between the colony and her tribe, of which her father was chief. She later married a different John Rolfe, who took her and their child back to England, where she would die of an illness. There's more to that story, but I'm just trying to provide some historical mile markers for you, for some context. There had been a significant European presence in the eastern parts of North and Central America prior to Plymouth. European activity began as seasonal excursions with temporary ports for fishing and whaling, but later evolved to more permanent operations. Being that the Americas were not vacant by any means, having been inhabited by a multitude of native peoples, there was considerable conflict over resources. The Europeans not only exerted dominance over the natives by force, enslavement, and genocide, they also plagued the land with diseases, to which the natives had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, typhus, among other Old World infections, devastated native populations. This is the stage on which the first Thanksgiving took place, a far cry from the cute little story of the first pilgrims arriving on the Mayflower to the welcoming arms of peaceful Indians who had never seen a white person before, and both parties behaved altruistically. If this time period piques your interest, I recommend reading 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created, by Charles C. Mann. That book is a follow-up to his other book, 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. Both are fantastic. Alright, so if there had been that much tension between European settlers and natives for 100 years, how did the Pilgrims at Plymouth manage to share a Thanksgiving meal with a tribe? Here's what really happened. A group of Puritans set sail to the Americas on the Mayflower, first arriving at Cape Cod in November, then in Plymouth in December of 1620. I don't know whose bright idea it was to land in New England so late in the year, but even I know that you're not going to fare too well by showing up at the end of harvest and at the beginning of a long winter, fresh off a boat, onto a foreign place, to start from scratch. Many accounts make it sound like the Pilgrims showed up early in 1620 and because of their inexperience with the land and climate, they had a bad harvest that fall. But no, they didn't even get a chance to plant crops or do much of anything else besides be cold and miserable, having arrived in freaking December. There were 102 passengers on the Mayflower, and almost half of them died that first winter. And guess what? One of those survivors was my ancestor. How cool is that? To be fair, there are about 10 million descendants of the Mayflower Pilgrims in the US alone. But hey, I'm one of them. Alright, so these poor, hungry, nearly frozen Plymouth colonists, the ones that barely survived the winter, would receive a very random visit from a Native American named Samoset. This guy spoke English. How in the world, you might ask? Well, he was part of a tribe from Maine and had learned English from having conducted business transactions with English fishermen and traders. He was in the Plymouth area to visit Massasoit, the leader of the local Wampanoag tribe. So Samoset paid the Plymouth colony a visit, but he wasn't doing it just to say hi, like, "Hey everybody, where y'all from?" No. Samoset had been acting as a sort of diplomat between tribes and a liaison between Europeans and the natives, translating, networking, facilitating trades, and gathering information. By visiting the Plymouth colony, he would stand to gain a new connection for trading goods or useful information. Like, are these settlers a threat, or can they be allies? After gauging the situation, Samoset introduced them to the Wampanoag tribe leader, Massasoit, and a peace treaty was signed by both parties. Each had something to gain by this treaty. Massasoit was motivated to make more friends than enemies, having suffered a severe reduction in population due to a recent epidemic, making them vulnerable to their enemies. And the Pilgrims were motivated to not continue dying. They too had lost a lot of their people, and were very interested in positive, conflict-free relations with the locals. They didn't need any more problems than they already had. Samoset also introduced the colony to someone I'm sure you've heard of, Squanto. His actual name was Tisquantum, and his story is worth telling. He was born a member of the Patuxet tribe, which was part of the larger body of the Wampanoag people. Just like Samoset, Squanto had had many interactions with European explorers, but unlike Samoset, Squanto had been taken captive by them. An English captain kidnapped Squanto and shipped him all the way to Spain to be sold as a slave. Local friars took notice of this unjust and illegal form of human trafficking and rescued him, with the ulterior motive to civilize him and convert him to Christianity. Squanto eventually managed to make it to London, and get this, he lived in London at the same time that Pocahontas did. It's plausible that their paths crossed, but there is no direct evidence of that, unfortunately. But anyway, after living in London for a while, Squanto finally found passage back to North America, landing in Newfoundland first, and making his way back home to Patuxet, only to find that his entire village had died of disease. And who would be there in their stead? You guessed it, the Plymouth colonists. I want to clarify that Squanto hadn't been traveling and living as an entirely independent agent. He had been under the command of one European man or another, beginning with his kidnapper, then the friars in Spain, then a merchant named John Slaney while in London, then his ticket back to America was an English-sponsored expedition to Newfoundland, and to get back to Patuxet, he joined a voyage led by navigator and explorer Thomas Dermer. So from the moment he was taken by a European, he would never truly be free of Europeans again. Imagine having been ripped away from your family, then spending several years trying to get back home, and when you finally arrive, you discover that everyone you've ever known is dead. That alone would be brutal enough. But then to see the exact location of your ancestral home be occupied by more Europeans? It's tragically poetic. As the sole survivor of his tribe, Squanto found himself without a family or a home, so he went to live with Massasoit and the Wampanoag Confederacy. And that takes us up to the point where Samoset introduces Squanto to the Pilgrims at Plymouth. Samoset would be on his way, but Squanto was there to stay. Being that he knew English from his unfortunate European journey, he was assigned to the colony to act as a translator and a guide. He proved vital to the Pilgrims' survival, teaching them what and how to plant crops, how to fertilize the soil, how to hunt and fish, where to hunt and fish, and how to trade with other tribes. Without Squanto's help, the Pilgrims would have been cooked, as the kids say. So now that you know the backstory, you can better appreciate how a fruitful harvest would have justified a big celebratory feast. Let's talk about the feast itself. Who was there and what did they eat? Today we observe Thanksgiving on one day, but the first Thanksgiving lasted 3 days. They didn't just eat the whole time, they also played games and drank beer and hard cider. As far as the menu goes, we can rule out pumpkin pie because they didn't have ovens, but the natives had taught the Pilgrims how to cook squash, and pumpkins are a type of squash, so there's that. We can also rule out stuffing and cranberry sauce, but cranberries are native to New England and were there from the beginning, making cranberries a quintessential side dish of Thanksgiving. We also know that they grew corn, spinach, arugula, and wheat, so those foods were likely part of the meal, as well as fish. But what about the centerpiece of a Thanksgiving meal? Well, we really can't be sure if there was turkey at the first Thanksgiving. Though Massachusetts was well stocked with wild turkeys, the records only mention wild fowl, which could include wild turkey, but it could also include duck, goose, or swan. In addition to wild fowl, Massasoit's people contributed 5 deer. So even if turkeys had been served, they wouldn't have been the main dish. They would have just been one of many meat options on the table. So that was the first of many annual Thanksgiving feasts between the Pilgrims and the natives, right? No. This was actually just a one-off, and it would have been lost to history had it not been for a letter that was found in 1841 written by one of the Pilgrims discussing the event. So 200 years had passed before anyone knew about it. And it gets crazier. By the time this letter was rediscovered in 1841, Thanksgiving had already become a New England tradition independently. It had its own origin, separate from the one in 1621. Isn't that nuts? So if New Englanders in the 1800s were celebrating Thanksgiving without knowing about the Plymouth Colony's Thanksgiving, where did the Thanksgiving tradition in New England come from? I'll answer that after this short break. This episode is brought to you by nothing. To help keep ads off this show, consider donating by clicking the Patreon link in the show notes or by going to patreon.com/ontheoriginofeverything. Another way you can support this show is by giving it a 5-star rating and review, or by following it, or sharing it. Let's build a community of people that are curious and always learning. Now, back to the show. Welcome back. I already mentioned that the origin of Thanksgiving as we know it didn't actually begin in Plymouth. We refer to it as the first one now because we know about it, and we only know about it because of the Winslow letter. Edward Winslow was one of the leading figures of the Plymouth colony, and this is the letter he wrote in 1621 that turned up in 1841, and it reads, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. Many of the Indians coming amongst them, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain, and others." Another letter, or manuscript rather, was found in 1856, written by William Bradford, the colony's governor. He had written a retrospective account of his voyage on the Mayflower and his time at Plymouth, but it was never published and was lost for a couple of 100 years before resurfacing. An excerpt reads, "They began now to come in, store of fowl, as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterward decreased by degrees. And as the governor had appointed," he's writing in the third person here, "they did set apart a time of solemn thanksgiving to God, and made a feast to the Indians, who came among them, and that they had of their good hospitality and plenty." So that's how we became wise to this shared meal of Thanksgiving between the Pilgrims at Plymouth and their Native American allies. But like I mentioned before, there had already been a Thanksgiving tradition in New England when these writings were discovered. So where did that tradition come from? It started with the Puritans. Multi-day observations of fasting, praying, and thanksgiving were regular parts of religious life for the Puritans. These were communal events involving several days of church services, typically in response to something like a victory or a hardship. These religious demonstrations didn't necessarily have to do with harvest, but over time, they turned into that. It's weird to think that fasting could evolve to feasting, but you have to take into account that not everyone was a Puritan in New England. Harvest festival traditions were also practiced by people in the area, and there was a melding of traditions throughout the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. The religious display of giving thanks to God from the Puritans, and the end of harvest feasting from other groups. By the time the Winslow letter resurfaced, Thanksgiving had become such a common thing that a certain Sarah Josepha Hale had already been trying to make Thanksgiving a national holiday for over a decade. Who was Sarah Josepha Hale? She was an editor of a popular women's magazine and loved Thanksgiving so much that she made it her mission to make it an official holiday. And she succeeded by writing a letter directly to Abraham Lincoln in 1863, pitching Thanksgiving as a way to unite the Union during such a divided time as the Civil War. He was all about that idea and declared it an annual national holiday to be observed on the last Thursday of every November. We owe Sarah Hale for giving us the Thanksgiving holiday. Some have called her the Mother of Thanksgiving. She also wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. Totally serious. Thank you, Sarah, for your important contributions to our country. Before Lincoln made it official, people had been celebrating Thanksgiving on random autumn days. He designated it to the last Thursday of November, and it would remain that way until 1939, when FDR moved Thanksgiving to the fourth Thursday, as there were 5 Thursdays in November that year. He did this to extend the Christmas shopping season, hoping to boost the economy. But a lot of people hated the idea and rebelled against it, feeling like it was too political and unnecessary, which contributed to its ineffectiveness to improve the economy. For a couple of years, some Americans continued to celebrate it on the last Thursday and some celebrated it on the fourth Thursday. In response to the confusion and tension, Congress stepped in and fixed the date of Thanksgiving to the fourth Thursday of November forevermore and made it a legal federal holiday. Now, have you ever wondered why it was always a Thursday? Why not a Sunday? Well, for many people, Sunday was the Lord's Day. You didn't throw a big party on the Sabbath, and the Puritans started their Sabbath observances at sunset the day before. So the weekend just wasn't going to work. Thursday worked much better for social events, as it was often the day of the week where ministers would give a mid-week sermon, and people were already gathered together, making it a practical time to hold such an event. That explains the Thursday thing, but where did the last Thursday of November come from? In 1848, Sarah Hale was quoted saying that the last Thursday of last November was kept as Thanksgiving Day in 24 of the 29 states that observed it. I can't be sure why those 24 states picked that specific day, but Sarah Hale's reasoning was that everyone was done with harvest by that point, and anyone who had suffered a summer-related illness would have had time to recover. Summer heat-related illnesses were a real thing back then. So maybe the practicality of a midweek day and the practicality of late November solves the riddle. But I suspect another influence. George Washington, back in 1789, had declared November 26th of that year a National Day of Thanksgiving, to celebrate the new government and Constitution. That November 26th was the last Thursday of the month, so maybe people looked to that for inspiration too. To wrap things up, I want to go through some loose notes of stuff that I found interesting. The Plymouth Pilgrims did not wear those buckle hats. That type of dress came later and was retroactively attributed to the Pilgrims. Benjamin Franklin wasn't serious when he suggested that the turkey be our national bird instead of the bald eagle. He did suggest it, but as a joke that no one wants to let go. The Christmas song Over the River and Through the Woods is actually a Thanksgiving song written in 1844. If you want confirmation, look up the original lyrics. It's pretty blatantly a Thanksgiving song. On a more modern note, The day before Thanksgiving is not the biggest travel day of the year, and it's not even close to being number one. It's not even in the top 25. The biggest travel days usually occur throughout the summer. No surprise there. And before I go, whatever happened to Squanto? After that first Thanksgiving, he started to feel his importance and influence a little too much and began to play both sides for personal gain. When Massasoit found out what he was up to, he turned him in to the Pilgrims for execution as part of the terms of their treaty. But Governor Bradford refused to kill Squanto as he was too valuable. Then, just a year after the first Thanksgiving, Squanto and some Pilgrims were out on a small expedition at Cape Cod seeking provisions, and he came down with something they called Indian fever, bleeding from the nose and everything, and he died within days. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a tragic end to this important figure, and a tragic way to end this episode. So I'll close by saying that the first Thanksgiving at Plymouth came to be seen as a powerful symbol of the possibility of working across deep cultural differences. Even though the harmonious conditions afforded by the peace treaty only lasted through the lifetimes of those who made it, and even though many breaches of treaties like it led to devastating consequences for the natives, the Plymouth Feast represents an ideal of unity and gratitude. I think to a degree it does accomplish that. Thanksgiving today is largely removed from partisan politics and not tied to any one religion, allowing people of different backgrounds and beliefs to gather together in a manner that would have made Sarah Hale and Abe Lincoln proud. And that concludes the episode on the origin of American Thanksgiving. I hope you learned something new. I sure did. And shout out to my buddy George, whose birthday lands on Thanksgiving this year. I call that birthday robbery. Sorry, dude. And that's it for today. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Until next time, so long. Research, music, and production was all done by Jezere Wilson. This podcast is listener-supported, owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything LLC in the United States. All rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.